Subscribe to our YouTube channel, Joy Learning TV.
Hello, lovely students. This is SHSR on Joy Learning channel. I am Adriana, your government facilitator as usual for today's lesson. You would quite recount on one of our previous lessons that we began to talk about pre-colonial or colonial issues. We talked about our chiefs, how they fared before, during, and after colonization. Then we talked about how some parts of West Africa, specifically places where the British colonized, were colonized, or systems that were used in colonizing these areas. We talked about Gold Coast then, Nigeria, the Gambia, and Sierra Leone. We also talked about the Crown Colony system, an administrative structure that helped the British to administer their colonies after they went for one of a very important conference in Germany. Today we will talk about how the Crown Colony was used and the system of government put in place so that the British or the British colonial system could be administered in their respective colonies. This system was known as the indirect rule. So the indirect rule was used with the help of the colonial structure, where we said that the governor or possibly the monarch was at the apex of this particular structure. Then came the Secretary of State for the colonies, and then came individual governments for each of the colonies under the British colonial rule. After them came the legislative and the executive councils. Today we'll talk about the indirect rule. It's an English word, isn't it? So indirect means what? That it was not directly administered by the powers in place, and it was a rule that was used to govern or subdue the people so that colonization could take place. Today, after we are done, we should be able to at least define what the indirect rule is. Then, we should be able to explain the features of the indirect rule. After that, we should be able to highlight reasons why it was adopted. And then, if we have time, we will talk about some negative and positive effects of the indirect rule. Are we on? Let's begin. Let's talk about how indirect rule came all about. Between the 17th and 18th century, British had found ways to conquer India and other colonies, and had been successful in colonizing here with the use of the indirect rule. Then Lord Lugard tried it in some parts of Nigeria between 1914 and 1919 AD and succeeded. He then wrote the Mandate in Tropical Africa in 1922. This had given the clue to other British colonies elsewhere on how to rule their colonies. So this is how the indirect rule originated. At a point in time, the Indian people had been colonized with the use of the same system, where the colonial power itself had not had direct contact with the people. And so Lord Lugard wrote in one of his books, or a book he wrote on the Mandate in Tropical Africa, on how the indirect rule was to be administered. And so he gave other governors the chance to use it on in other colonies of theirs. And it actually worked. Let's see what indirect rule means. Let's see if we can understand and define it to our understanding. When we say indirect rule, we say it is a British colonial policy in which native institutions and personnel were employed to administer their colonies in West Africa. The idea of transmitting British systems under the supervision of British officials. I'm going to take it again. Indirect rule is a British colonial policy in which native institutions and personnel were employed to administer their colonies in West Africa with the idea of transmitting British systems under the supervision of British officials. So it meant that the authorities or institutions in place before colonization were still important because these were the institutions the British used to administer their colonies. But then their main focus was to transmit British systems of rule to the colonies or into Africa, specifically West Africa, under the supervision of British officials. Have we understood it up to this end? Remember that we would want to talk more specifically about West Africa. It was a system of rule used by the British colonial administration to manage her colonies. This system made use of indigenous or traditional political systems in the colonies. The British realized it was feasible using the existing traditional political system in place than to impose a new system to the African. As a matter of fact, they felt that it was a waste of time because when they came into some parts of Africa, they realized that there were structures that were right. And so it was so easy to use the traditional systems or political systems that were in place. Let's talk about some of these traditional systems. Remember, we talked about the chieftaincy institution, and we said that it was a political system that administered its own jurisdictions, possibly some ethnic groups that had centralized systems, and they had good systems in place, where there was the paramountcy, there were divisional chiefs, there were sub-chiefs, there was the Queen Mother, Council of Elders or Kingmakers, and there were the people or their Safo companies. These were political institutions that were good, and it helped the colonial system or the colonial administrators to indirectly rule the people through these political systems. And this was indirect rule. So let's see what it was in actual sense by looking at the features. I guess you understand what features mean. Characteristics that makes it different from any other system. So the indirect rule kind of would say that it's different from democracy, it's different from autocracy. It had its own peculiar features that made it distinct. Remember also that the indirect rule used what? The traditional political systems in place, so that there was no need adopting a new one. The first of these features was known as the native authority. The native authority. These were traditional rulers. This one will say that they were traditional rulers and were in charge of were the native authorities. In actual sense, we say that the native authority were made up of traditional rulers. That is paramount chiefs, divisional chiefs, and sub-chiefs. Is that one clear? When we talk about the native authority, we are talking about traditional rulers. Traditional rulers made up what was known as the native authority, instituted by the Crown Colony system. Is that right? Good. Now, we said that the British merged a number of states and appointed a paramount chief as the head. The paramount chief was aided by other smaller chiefs or councillors. Their role was to, one, implement British laws in their locality. So let's go back and see this. That the British would put a number of states or a number of ethnic groups. Remember that they did not see these ethnic groups as states. They saw them as individual ethnic groups. So you would find the Akans, the Tree-speaking and the Fanti-speaking Akans. You see the Gans, you see the Evers, you see the Northern Territories, you would see the Ahantes. Is that all right? And these were ethnic groups. They merged them, they put some of them together to form a group. And for each group, they appointed a paramount chief. And the paramount chief was aided by sub-chiefs as well as what? Councillors or other divisional chiefs. And their major role, one, was to implement British laws in their localities. Remember also that the reasons why they came in, especially to Africa, was to transmit their British culture, their laws, their lifestyle, their language, and saw ours, or saw the African, as a little barbaric and uncivilized. And so they intended to implement their laws in the localities in which these paramountcies or paramount chiefs had been merged. Then they also used the native authority to maintain law and order in the colony. Remember this, that no matter what happened, the people believed more in their chiefs, honored them, trusted them than the aliens or the British colonial government. And therefore they ruled through the chiefs and found a way to maintain law and order within the colonies using their own chiefs, or using these chiefs that made the native authority. In effect, they also expected the native authority, that is, these chiefs or traditional rulers, to help in providing social amenities for the people. Amenities such as schools, hospitals, good roads, and a host of amenities you can mention yourself. And so with regards to this, the native authority had the mandate to work with the British, all right, and a kind of, they acted as an intermediary between the people and the British colonial system. And they were used to do the bidding of the British. They made them important, and so they named them the native authority. Note, where there was no centralized traditional system with chiefs, governments or warrant chiefs were appointed. Now, when they came into the Gold Coast, or when the colonial master, or possibly the colonial administration, was within the Gold Coast, now I guess that from 1919, I've already told you what the Gold Coast was. It was made out of the southern states, which was the original Gold Coast colony. Then Ashanti by conquest, the last submission we talked about it. Then we talked about the Trans-Togoland, which was given to the British as trustees. Then we talk about the Northern Territories. Good. In this sense, this is Gold Coast. But in places where there were no centralized traditional system, when we say centralized traditional systems, we are talking about a system or an ethnic group that had a proper hierarchy of authority, from chiefs to queen mothers to council of elders to Asafo companies or paramilitary groups with their people. And we also said that there were the acephalous assemblies or the acephalous societies where family heads ruled their own, clan heads ruled their own, and village heads ruled their own. There was no central authority. So where the British didn't find such things, like in the Telansi clans or Telansi groups, or some places in Yoruba in the northern states, they would put what we call warrant chiefs, self-appointed or government-appointed chiefs, which is quite alien to the African society, where we said that it was the people themselves who chose their own chief, and there were lineages from where these chiefs originated from. So in this sense, we realized that it was a little different from what we saw. So these warrant chiefs did the bidding of the British and joined the native authority to administer the colonies. The second one of these features, or another feature of the indirect rule, was resident commissioners. These commissioners lived within the colonies. They lived in areas of jurisdiction. So we say the Gold Coast was divided into sections or regions. For each region, a regional commissioner was appointed. Regions were further divided into provinces. Provincial commissioners were appointed for each province. So then we had the resident commissioners, or the commissioners. Now, what we now see as Gold Coast was divided into regions. In the past, we didn't have 10 regions, but were divided into a kind of sections known as regions. And for each region, the British Crown or the British Crown system would appoint a regional commissioner over a particular region. Then the region will be furthermore subdivided into what we call provincial areas or provinces. And over these provincial areas, provincial commissioners were also appointed. Their role was to supervise the chiefs within their area of jurisdiction. So what they did was that if there was a native authority within the jurisdiction of either the regional or the provincial commissioner, he supervised what they did with regards to policies that were going to be administered, as well as the maintenance of law and order. They also transmitted formulated British policies to the people via the chiefs for implementation. They transmitted formulated British policies to the people via the chiefs for implementation. So they go for meetings, or they go to some high order meetings. They come with the formulated policies from the British. Then they will hand it over to the chiefs. And then the chiefs would administer these unpopular policies, which were quite alien to the people of Africa. They were also a link between the people and the governor, which meant that apart from the chiefs, the resident commissioners who lived within these areas and lived with the people would take the views of the people, would take the grievances of the people and move directly to the governor and let him know about it. The third feature is known as the native treasury. The native treasury was an ordinance attached to the native authority. So an ordinance is a law. I hope you are getting it. So when we say an ordinance, we are saying that it was a law attached to the native authority. This was a vault or a depository center for the collection of fines and taxes. These monies were collected by the chiefs from their subjects. A large part of this revenue source was sent to the governor to pay salaries of government officials. The rest was left in the locality for development. So the third one is known as the native treasury. The native treasury was held or was part of the native authority. In a way, we say that this is a depository or a place where we collected fines and taxes. So then, let's see how these taxes were collected. Remember that before colonization or before the colonial administration was established in the Gold Coast, in Nigeria, in the Gambia and Sierra Leone, there was no money economy. People did not know what money was. We were not using coins and notes. What we're doing was exchanging goods for goods, kind of barter system, isn't it? Today we use money and we use it for the exchange of goods and services for the value they weigh. It started in the colonial system, where taxes were imposed on the citizenry by the colonial government through the chiefs. Have we understood? The taxes were part of an ordinance, or was part of a law passed or a policy passed by the colonial administrations, possibly the legislative and the executive councils and the governor would institute such taxes and will send it through the resident commissioners or the commissioners to the chiefs. And the chiefs would go down to their people, let them know what this particular policy or order was, and then they were expected to collect the taxes themselves, as well as fines from issues sent to courts. Then it was deposited in the native treasury. As and when the British administration demanded, the chiefs would send a large portion of this particular source, revenue source, to the administration of the colonial government, which was told to the people that it would be used to pay for the salaries of officials of the state, would also be used to construct roads, build hospitals, build schools, and the rest. And the rest was left, whatever was left of this particular revenue was left within the particular native authority or particular area of jurisdiction. And the main purpose was to help the native authority to administer their areas of rule or jurisdiction. The next one, very interestingly, was the native courts. Before colonization, we also learned that the chiefs were in charge of administering justice in their localities. What they did was that when somebody flaunted the rules or a taboo was committed, the chief and his elders, sometimes with the queen mother, would sit and administer justice and give justice, or would declare justice as see fit of that particular crime. When we signed some treaties and bonds, that particular authority was taken away from the chiefs, and there was an institution of what was known as the native court. Each level within the colony had its own courts, presided over by native professional or paramount chiefs. And therefore, in Nigeria, some parts of Nigeria, the Muslim community were also allowed to provide some Muslim educated jurists or lawyers, or let's say judges, so that they will be able to administer their areas within the colony. But in the Gold Coast, professional lawyers or sometimes paramount chiefs were used as the judges or the judges over such issues within the native courts. And the native police was instituted. The native police were ordinary Africans who had been employed by the crown system to help in the maintenance of law and order. And prisons were also instituted back then. Remember that in our traditional system in the past, we didn't have what was known as prisons. Possibly there was a holding cell, and administratively, justice was administered as the crime came. Nobody was held somewhere for any purpose. But then in this native court, there was a prison which helped to enforce law and order within the colony. Then there was the governor of the colony. Then there was the governor of the colony. And so we'll come to the issue of the reasons why the indirect rule was instituted in West Africa. But let me go back to something. Another part or a feature we actually forgot to add to the indirect rule was the prominence of the governor. And so the governor oversees everything that happened, whether it was the native authority, it was the regional or the commissioners, or it was the native court. He was the boss of all these institutions. I hope we have gotten that right. So we are adding the governor to it. Let's look at the aims of the indirect rule in West Africa. Why was it instituted? One, it was to develop the African to be competent enough to partake in modern politics within the traditional or the local area. I think that I have said it earlier on, where we said that when they came, or when the British or the other European bodies came into Africa, they realized that, or they felt that our system of rule was a little barbaric, a little uncivilized. And therefore, for them, their system of rule was to be adopted. And so they created that particular impression. So one of the aims for the indirect rule was to help or to develop the African to be a competent ruler, so that he or she will be able to partake in modern politics. Then, it was also to preserve the traditional system. What it meant was that they didn't want to do away with the traditional systems we had in place. All they wanted to do was only to use it, but not to destroy it. So at the end of the day, they wanted to make sure that our traditional political systems were still intact. But then they would have done what they wanted to do, or they would have ruled the people as they saw fit. The next reason why they came in with the indirect rule was to transmit British systems into the colonies, such that we were going to see the British colonial government and its system of rule in our system as well. Let's see the reasons why we adopted the indirect rule. So there were 3 aims. We'll go back to it again. The one, it was to help the African to be competent. 2, to preserve our traditional system. And 3, to transmit the British system into the colonies. Why in the first place did we adopt, or was the indirect rule adopted by the British? There were reasons to this. It was not just done. One of them was that there was a shortage of British personnel. Africa then had become what we call the white man's grave. They had issues with malaria, especially whilst mosquitoes were in abundance, isn't it? Plus other environmental issues that didn't augur well for the systems of the British nationals. And so at a point in time, majority of them had died when they had come here. And there was the fear that when they came back, some of them would still die. And so British personnel was in shortage. It became important that they rather employ Africans to do their bidding whilst they supervised. The second one was the vastness of the area to govern. Truth be told, is that Africa as it is very vast, very big, a large expanse of land. And therefore, a few British personnel couldn't have done what they did if it was not for the help of the traditional rulers as well as the educated elites of that time. And so the area was vast to govern, and they needed people, particularly the indigenes of the area, to help rule the people. They also feared resentment or opposition. Now they had come in during the slave trade and had seen how the Africans behaved. And so one thing they feared most was the fact that because their policies were alien to was alien to the policies of the African or their system of rule, they feared that the African would resent them or would oppose them. And therefore they had to use people or authorities the citizenry were comfortable with, so that they could be compromised enough to accept the rule. The next one was that there was existence of a well-organized traditional system already in place. If we had followed from a former presentation we had made, then you have realized that the system in place was good and was well organized, where the people trusted in their chiefs, in their queen mothers. They believed in their council of elders and kingmakers. They would agree and would trust and obey their Asafo companies. And therefore they realized that the system in place was good. All they had to do was to supervise and push in alien policies so that the people would obey. Then there was the language or communication problems. We sometimes, even in our modern times, we say some people are illiterate. They are not. It's the only thing they are illiterate in is in the language they have no idea about, which is the English language. It was alien and foreign to us. That does not make somebody an illiterate. If that person can read Ga, it doesn't make the person an illiterate, isn't it? And so they had issues with communication, where they couldn't effectively and directly communicate with the people. So if I was a fancy and I met the white man, or I met the British, there was no way we could communicate. The only thing we could do was sign language. And so that alone was a problem for them. And therefore they needed fronts, or they needed people who would communicate their ideas to the people in their local language. And that one was the reason why they adopted the indirect rule. Then there was the issue of finance. Now, as we talked about the fact that the place was vast, if you are going to bring British nationals, it means that you're going to pay them per their position. And so it was good to rather use the indigenes who in actual reasons or in actual cases didn't even know what the money economy was. So they would get them to do their bidding, and a few incentives would be given, and then it would work. Then they had little knowledge of colonial territories. In reality, it was the African that helped the British know the boundaries of some of their colonial territories or colonies. And so it was important that they use the African to colonize his own people through the indirect rule, because they did not know the width and breadth of areas they had occupied. It was only the African who could do that, and therefore it was good to use him. And it was also a success story in other colonies. It was a success story in other colonies. It had been used in other colonies. Some parts of Nigeria had gone through the system and it had worked. India had worked. Other colonies had worked. And therefore, it was something they could also do or could also use in other colonial territories. Then transportation problems. Moving from one area to the other was a problem for the British. And therefore, it became important is that the people themselves ruled. They ruled through the people, they ruled through the chiefs to the people, because it was impossible to move from one area to the other. In most cases, these were uninhabited lands, made up of forests and the rest. And so it was difficult to get the people to the British to go into the hinterland. So it was better to use the chiefs and their people to go through it. And that was why the native authority, the residents, commissioners, the native courts, as well as other native institutions were instituted so that colonization can take place. Why did the indirect rule succeed in the Gold Coast? If there were so many problems that we have mentioned before, how come it succeeded? One, there was the existence of centralized systems with leaders. And these leaders had already compromised their position by signing agreements and bonds, had gone to wars with them and had lost, had come to them personally for protection and had been entrusted to them. And so their systems were already in place. All they had to do was to rule through the institutions that were available, especially through the chiefs and their elders, and it made it a success story. There was also the existence of an effective tax system. In Nigeria and in the Gold Coast, there were systems in place where the chiefs and the leaders of the communities or ethnic groups had instituted so that they could collect taxes and tributes from their people or from the citizenry. And so when they came in, it became very easy for them to succeed in colonizing or in using the indirect rule to get to the people. There was the absence of well-organized opposition. During the colonial system, it was impossible to set up political parties. Even with those who had been trained by the British and had been sent during the slave trade or even after the slave trade, had accompanied the British to Britain and other places in Americas and the rest, and they had been educated. It was impossible to form political parties until sometime when we had gotten ready to become self-independent, or we had become ready for we had gotten ready for self-governance. Then political parties had sprung back. But in the past, there was no well-organized opposition. Nobody opposed them. Also remember this, that there was the issue of arms. What we could arm ourselves were the cutlasses. I think in the north they had arrows and bows and the rest. But the gun was faster. And the gun worked. They had cannonballs and the cannon, all right? And so those things were present. It became impossible for anybody to object or to oppose the British system. So that was it. Then there was the existence of the native court. The native court was overseen or was administered by the paramountcy or the paramount chief. And issues of higher degrees or we say crimes with aggravating circumstances were sent to the colonial administration. In this sense, once there was a local court already in place, then instituting the native court was very easy to do. And so that is why the indirect rule also succeeded. Then there was religious tolerance. In the past, the traditional religion had been in place, where we had believed in ancestors and the deities. At the advent of colonization, it also appeared with religions like Christianity, Islam, Buddhism, Hinduism, Shintoism, and the rest. And these kinds of religions preach tolerance, that we humble ourselves so that we can get good things. That gave the African a mellowed spirit so that the British colonial government would be able to rule. Then there was a retention of some powers of the chiefs that made it impossible for them to object to the indirect rule. Remember that at some point in time when they had signed treaties, some powers of theirs had been taken from them. Remember that they did not have the power for taxation. They could not form armies. They, at a point in time, were not part of even the executive arm of government or the executive council that formulated policies for the betterment of their own people. They were also not part, at some point in time, at the very early parts of colonization, they were also not part of the legislative assembly. And so it made it more better or more efficient for the British colonial rule to succeed in the indirect rule, particularly in the Gold Coast. But in other places, they had some oppositions like in Nigeria, and it was less expensive. The chiefs will rule, collect taxes, and the taxes they collected from their own people were used to pay them. It was less expensive because the residents' commissioners were paid with the taxes collected from the people. Britain brought nothing. Everything was done here, and therefore it became very, very much easier for the colonial masters to do it, or the colonial administration to succeed. Let's talk about some positive effects of the indirect rule. Remember that we said that indirect rule is a system of rule used by the British to do what? To administer the colonies through their chiefs or their leaders. Was it effective? How positive was it? Was it beneficial to the people of the Gold Coast back then? One of them is the reduced cost of colonial administration. Take it or leave it. It was the people who pay the colonial administration. And so the issue of Britain paying its own workers here was not really functional. It was the colonies that paid the colonial administration, and therefore it was at a reduced cost, very cheap. Secondly, they also used the chiefs, and the chiefs were paid small amounts of coins and shillings and the rest, and so it wasn't really so expensive. Good. Secondly, it was good because it helped to maintain law and order. The chiefs were used to maintain law and order in the colony. Either than that, there would have been chaos because most of their policies were unpopular and they did not really augur well for the people of the colonial era or within the colonies. And therefore we say that it had positive effects because it helped us to put in place some institutions as we see now who will be able to administer law and order within the system. During the colonial era, we had the advantage of having the police. We had the advantage of having the what? The institution of the police. They are still here with us. Then we had the military. They have come to stay. And so at a point in time, we said that these are some of the positive effects of the indirect rule. Then there was a preservation of the African culture. Seriously speaking, after colonization, our chiefs are still where they are. Our culture was not dented. Our culture was not taken away. It still stays with us. And at a point in time, we have even said that it has been enhanced because in the past, our chiefs were not formally educated. Today, almost all of them are formally educated. So these are some of the effects positively that has affected the colonies after colonization. That is positive effects of the indirect rule. Then there was the development of nationalism. Before colonization, we never sat down together. We never agreed that we're all going to be one people. The Akans stayed in their territory. The Akans stayed in their territory. The Fantis stayed in their territory. The Anglos stayed in their territories. The Evers stayed in their territories. The Ga and Ga Dangbe stayed in their territories. The Northerners stayed in their territories. There was no time when we wanted to stand together as one people. During colonization, we found it very important through the indirect rule that we were one people, and therefore we began to develop the feeling for nationalism, the fact that we are a unifying force and that we could come together as one group of people. And that is one of the positive effects of the indirect rule. Then there was the integration of the ethnic groups. During the colonial times, for effective colonization and administration, ethnic groups were merged together. Some of them were cut off, but majority were put together. And that brought about an integration and a unifying force with the ethnic groups that are now found in what is now known as Ghana. Then the exposure of chiefs to modern forms of rule. Then there was the exposure of the chiefs to modern forms of rule. In current times, we now realize that our chiefs have adapted foreign, or we say formal forms or modern forms of rule that was a little alien to them before colonization. And so it exposed them, especially those who have the chance to be on the executive councils and the legislative councils. It gave them the advantage of learning some new forms of government that were different, or new forms of rule that were different from their forms of rule. And that alone brought them success. Let's talk about some of the negative effects of the indirect rule. What are some of the negativities that affected the people as well as the colony during the indirect rule? There was the distortion of chieftaincy. That is, the chieftaincy institution was distorted. Practically, even now, it is the Queen Mother who nominates the chief. It's the kingmakers who nominates and grooms the chief for installments. Is that right? Now, during colonization, with the use of the indirect rule, the chiefs could be distilled. There was an incident of an Aguna chief who was disposed of by his people, but then the tradition, let's say the colonial administration reinstalled him and made him still rule because he did their bidding. And so in that time, you would realize that the chiefs could be installed or distilled even by the British administration. And that brought a distortion in the chieftaincy institution. Apart from that, it also created a lot of problems for the people, because people who did not come from the correct lineages were allowed to be chiefs. And that has also brought about a backlog of problems for our modern society. Now, the people known as the educated elites are people who had had the chance to have formal education under the British and other European bodies or European states. They had learned new forms of rule. They had experienced democracy. They had experienced some form of monarchical systems and the rest, and had come back into their colonies after the education. At a point in time, they were expected to have joined the ruling government or the colonial administration to govern the people, but then they were excluded. And that alone was a waste of brain strength, isn't it? The fact that they had studied and we could use them to administer the colonies, but they were excluded. And that was another negative effect of the indirect rule. It also encouraged frictions between the chiefs and their subjects. I think the last time we met, we said that if you're going to use another person as a betweener, another betweener was going to negatively affect your life, then there's going to be a problem between who that betweener was, isn't it? There was going to be a problem with who that betweener or the intermediary was. And so that is what happened. At a point in time, the people of the Gold Coast felt that they had been betrayed by their chiefs. They had been betrayed by their chiefs. And therefore, should I say it again? They had been betrayed by their chiefs. And therefore, it became impossible for them to trust their chiefs. Have we understood it? We say that at a point in time, it had become... And so we said at a point in time, the people felt that they had been betrayed by their chiefs and therefore couldn't trust them any longer. This created problems, especially when they introduced foreign policies brought by the British through the residents or the commissioners to the people. It created a lot of problems where the people would say, we wouldn't agree. The chief says, you have to do it. And at a point in time, it brought so much disagreement and conflict between the chiefs and their people. As a matter of fact as well, it degraded the chiefs before their people, where the chiefs will have, in the past, you would have to go and beg the chief, isn't it? And even before you saw the chief, who are you going to see? The linguist. This time, the chief had to go and beg his people so that the British wouldn't get agitated and possibly vent their anger on their people. So that alone created a lot of problem. Then it breeded autocratic chiefs. For the chiefs to be able to do the bidding of the British administration through the indirect rule, they were upgraded, sort of. Chiefs were given excessive powers to use on their own people. In this sense, we said that the Queen Mother had no say in this. Remember, we said that when the chiefs were misbehaving or they were misconducting themselves, the Council of Elders or kingmakers, their Safo companies, could distill them. Now this time, these people didn't have so much dominance over the colonies any longer or their areas of jurisdiction. And so the British administration gave the chiefs so much unlimited power, and that made them autocratic. They began to treat their own people poorly, and that was a negative effect that has affected us until now, because it has also degraded some of the honor and prestige we gave, or the African gave, to his chief and elders. It also breeded a corrupted system. Corruption, especially with the chiefs, who would collect taxes and would not send it to the colonial administration, who would collect taxes and use them to their own benefit, who would collect taxes and would not do what was mandated of them. And so that alone was a negative impact on the system or the colonial or the colonies. Now that we have said all this, now you realize that the indirect rule with the use of the crown system had its own negative and positive effect. It affected the African negatively. It also affected the African positively. All these were done because a more powerful country or a more powerful state created dependencies economically, socially on a weaker state. Why did the educated elites oppose the indirect rule? Why did they say they didn't want it any longer? Why did they feel? Why did they feel? What was that feeling they had that the indirect rule was not appropriate for the Gold Coast? One, if it was that appropriate, then we say that they were excluded. I think we explained earlier on that the educated elite were people who had gone to European states and the Americas to study politics. Not only politics, they had also studied a lot of concepts and had studied several subjects that would have made it better for them to have administered the colonies themselves, possibly with the chiefs. But unfortunately, when they returned to Africa, the British colonial governments refused to use them. It was in a later date, possibly through the Gettysburg Constitution and other constitutions, that they were given the mandate to be part of the executive and the legislative assemblies. But practically, they were excluded. One, they believed that they should have been the people who should have implemented the policies, because these policies the formulating and implementation of these policies were alien policies they had learnt in institutions outside the Gold Coast in Europe, and that the traditional rulers did not have an idea about what politics was all about. They were also excluded because they were not allowed to formulate political parties that even existed in some of these European states. And so they felt that they had been excluded, and that is why they opposed it. They did not want it. And they had to fight on and fight on and fight on until, at long last, we were given independence. And it was the educated elite who championed our self-governance. Then they also opposed it because it delayed the political development in the Gold Coast. They had seen, or they had experienced, governance under European powers. And they had seen how politically the European states had developed, had advanced in terms of politics. When they came into the Gold Coast with the use of the chiefs and some local people, they realized that the political advancements or political development in the Gold Coast was too slow for their liking. They would have wished that the British administration had allowed them to take part in the political advancements or development of the state, and they would have moved it forward. Firstly, there was no political parties. Secondly, there was no advantage for any other person to create pressure groups so that it will pressure them or the British administration to quit. So then we said that they opposed it because it delayed political development in the Gold Coast. Thirdly, we said that there were always the conflicts between the educated elites and the chiefs. The educated elites felt that the chiefs had occupied their positions because in reality they had studied politics and had studied modern forms of governance. And the chiefs also felt that the educated elites did not come from a ruling class and had no right to rule their people. The educated elites also realized that the chiefs were being used, they were being manipulated. And so it created a lot of conflicts, a lot of controversies in that time between the chiefs and the educated elites. And these are some of the reasons why they opposed the indirect rule, because it created problems for the chiefs they so much revered. It created problems for the chiefs they so much honored because their positions were at stake. And they saw the chiefs as kowtowing down to an authority that should have rather kowtowed to them. And so there was the opposing of the indirect rule. There was also the distortion of the chieftaincy institution. They did not also understand why the chiefs would sit back and watch the British institution or the British government take over the governance of their areas and make a mockery of the chieftaincy institution, where people who did not belong to some particular bloodlines or gates were allowed to become chiefs, where a chief who had been originally installed by his own people can be destilled by the British. He didn't understand why in some localities where there were no chiefs, the British could institute warrant chiefs so that they could do their bidding. And therefore they felt that the indirect rule distorted or created a bad image for the chieftaincy institution. And that is another reason why they opposed it. Then they also saw that it retarded the socio-economic development of the colonies. Under normal circumstances, or with some of the promises that were made by the British administration, with the collection of the poll taxes, it was alleged that it would be used to build schools, hospitals, roads, a whole lot of social amenities and infrastructural developments for the people. They realized that these things were not happening. There were no schools, there were no hospitals, there were no banks that they had seen in the European states. There was nothing that all they could see was a rule that took advantage of the African through their chiefs. What they also saw was the fact that there were institutions that only benefited the British colonial system. The use or the construction of railways to siphon or to send away raw materials from the Gold Coast, institutions that only trained British children, health facilities that only catered for British nationals. And they realized that there was a backlog of retardation that retarded the progress of what is now known as Ghana, and therefore they opposed the indirect rule because it was unfair. Then there was the absence of a training ground for future leaders. If you were to study carefully the features of the indirect rule, then it did not give room for younger people to be trained as future leaders. The impression was that it meant that the British were going to be here forever. They would rather train their own and get them to replace them when they are gone. Our chiefs were old. Our leaders were old. But then there was no opportunity or avenue where the educated elite saw that the British were grooming younger people for administrations for the future. And so they resented their indirect rule. Then came the corruption of some of the chiefs. Not all of them. We stand to be corrected. Not all of them. But most of them were corrupt. They had seen the beautiful things that the British would give, especially with the new system of money economy. And it also brought about expensive jewelries that were made from the gold that they took from the African, and beautiful things, oil and the rest. And therefore, the chiefs became corrupt. They began to love money. They began to love beautiful things, flashy things that were presented to them by the British colonial administration. And so they became corrupt. This and more are some of the reasons why the educated elite, those who had studied outside or within the white man's territory in his own land, began to oppose and not want too much the success of the indirect rule. Have we gotten this right? So we have now realized that the indirect rule, all right, the crown system used the indirect rule to colonize the people. The colonization system was not directly done by the British colonial administration. It was done by the colonial administration through the active use of the chiefs and their leaders, of the people. And we've said that it had positive and negative effects on the people. Apart from that, there were some major reasons why the indirect rule was used. It had to do with the fact that there was not much personnel. It had to do with the fact that Africa was very large, and administering them with the few personnel they had would have been impossible if not for the help of the British. One thing I would want us to be more attentive about is the features of the indirect rule. So the first one is the native authority. I hope you have understood that one. That one has to do with the use of traditional rulers. Then the second one was the resident commissioners. Then came the native treasuries that was attached to the native authority. And the last one was the native courts. I would want to give you an assignment, and when you are done, you'd go and look for your government teacher in school and see if you can help out. Let's write this down. In what ways did the indirect rule succeed in the Gold Coast? In what ways? Let's write the question again. I hope you have your pen and paper there. In what ways did the indirect rule under the Crown Colony system, in what ways did the indirect rule under the Crown Colony system of the British administration succeed in the colonies? In what ways did the indirect rule under the Crown Colony system of the British administration succeed in the colonies? I hope you have gotten it right. So when you are done, you would look for your government teacher, tell your government teacher, I've asked you to come to him or her to help you understand or possibly mark your work for you. Thank you so much. Now, in doing some of your works or in some of your studies, with the indirect role in mind, these are some of the references you can refer to. You can refer to the GES syllabus for senior high schools, government Form 1 to 3. And then these other government textbooks, dependable material, government for SHS from Kwesipra, then government made simple by E.A. Metal Nunu, and all-inclusive government by Vincent J. Good. You can see them displayed on your screen. So when you have time, you can look for, at least everybody must have one of them. If you don't have any of them, you can go online and then solicit, or you can look for information from some online sources. Then you can do your work properly. All too soon, we have come again to the end of another presentation. The next time we'll meet, we'll talk about the French colonial administration and how they were also colonized. Apart from Ghana or the Gold Coast, Gambia, Sierra Leone, and Nigeria, almost all West African countries are francophone in nature, which means that they were most of the time colonized by the French. We'll talk about them in our next presentation. But then until we meet again, I hope you will learn harder. And remember, COVID is now around, so stay safe and have a good day.
Subscribe to our YouTube channel, Joy Learning TV.